Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar on the nature restoration law. And I'd like to thank everyone for registering and everyone turning up tonight. It's going to be a really, really good webinar, I think. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So for those of you that don't know, the Irish Wildlife Trust is a charitable organisation. We're a non-government organisation, and our main goal is to protect and restore nature. And we do that through advocating and educating people on nature and biodiversity issues. So if you would like to help support the Irish Wildlife Trust, you can do this by becoming a member. So whenever you become a member, you will get our quarterly print magazine, which has got loads of beautiful photographs in it, and it's got lots of exclusive articles and things like that. And it'll also help us to keep doing events such as this and events in person as well, and help keep them free and inclusive for everybody. So my name is Grace, and I'm the Marine Advocacy Officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. And we're delighted to have Guy here with us this evening, who is an expert in agroecology. And he's going to give us a really comprehensive presentation on the nature restoration law. Before that, I'm going to give a quick overview on what has happened so far with the law and what happens next. And then at the end, we're going to have time for some questions. So if you just pop the questions into the Q&A box, I'll be able to monitor that and we'll be able to get to them at the end. So I will just share my screen. So the EU Nature Restoration Law. So what is it? So this is a law that aims to restore 20% of EU land and 20% of EU sea by 2030. So this is probably one of the most important pieces of environmental legislation that has come out of the EU in the last 30 years. What has happened so far? So it was proposed back in June 2022 by the European Commission, and it was an extremely ambitious text back then. And then in December of 2022, we had the first meeting of the European Council. So the European Council is made up of representatives from each member state. So we would have had Irish representation at this first meeting of the Council. And unfortunately, back then, Ireland took quite a weak stance on the nature restoration law. They were calling for greater flexibility and stating that there wasn't enough data available to be able to enact restoration targets, and that there wasn't enough funding to collect this data. So there was a few member states that were calling for flexibility, but there was also a lot of member states that said that the law was great and that it actually wasn't ambitious enough. They wanted to have more ambitious targets to restore nature. So 2023 was the big year for the nature restoration law. There was an unprecedented, massive misinformation campaign to reject this law that was mostly spearheaded by the biggest group in the European Parliament, the EPP, which is the European People's Party. So there was scaremongering, there was very alarming statements. So it's no surprise that there was so much worry among farmers about the nature restoration law, and that there was a massive divide on it. And we'll go into some of the misinformation later on in my talk and further as well in Guy's talk as well. So alongside this misinformation campaign, NGOs got together and launched the campaign Restore Nature. So this campaign was calling on EU citizens to contact their MEPs and their representatives in the council and ask them to support a strong nature restoration law. So after this massive campaign, they actually had just under 1.2 million signatures of EU citizens asking for a strong law. And I'm really happy to say that Ireland was actually had the third highest uptake in the Restore Nature campaign per capita. And we'll take this opportunity to say thank you to every single one of you that signed the petition and got letters sent to your representatives. So it wasn't just environmentalists, NGOs and citizens that were calling for this law. There was over 6,000 scientists that called on the European Parliament to enact a strong nature restoration law, to listen to the science, that there's no time to lose and that this needed to be done as soon as possible. And aside from scientists, there was also hundreds of businesses, and not necessarily environmentally forward businesses, calling on the EU to enact the law, because they could already see that through the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis that they're already losing money, and that the economy will suffer if we don't effectively restore nature. So the law had to go through several different committee votes, and another council vote happened in June of 2023. And at this council vote, Ireland actually was a champion of the law and was very supportive of it. And then a month after that, we had the final plenary vote on the text, and the law was passed through plenary. This is where all MEPs have to vote. And we're happy to say again that all 13 Irish MEPs voted to get the law through this stage. So the law then entered trialogue negotiations, because the law looked quite different from the initial Commission proposal back in 2022, and it was weakened significantly. So it went into trialogue negotiations and was then made stronger. There had to be compromises on both sides, for the environmental side and then also on the side of the people who did not want the law to go through. So why is it so important? So over 80% of EU habitats actually have poor or bad conservation status, or they're in decline. So there is no time to waste at all in restoring these habitats. So one of the benefits would be the socioeconomic benefits. So the European Commission did a report looking at this, and they found that for every €1 that's invested in nature restoration will generate anywhere between 8 and 38 euros in socioeconomic benefits. Healthy ecosystems as well are also going to increase ecotourism, which will then have a knock-on effect on the local economy, such as restaurants and hotels. And if you ask any fisherman or fisherwoman or farmer, they will say that healthy ecosystems are needed for their livelihoods. So nature restoration will help ensure sustainable jobs for generations to come. Another reason why it's so important is food security. Healthy ecosystems are going to help ensure food security in the long term, because we need healthy soils for crops, we need healthy soils for grazing animals, and we also need to have healthy numbers of pollinators to pollinate these crops as well. Another really important aspect of nature restoration is the climate change mitigation that it would provide. So there are many different ecosystems which store carbon, such as seagrass, forests, different sediments in the ocean, and also peatlands. So these ecosystems actually hold on to carbon, which then obviously has a beneficial effect in climate change mitigation. And aside from that, there's already been a lot of extreme weather events due to climate change, and healthy ecosystems are more resilient to this. So flood mitigation, for example, if our rivers are able to flow naturally into their natural flood plains, that will help prevent flooding in areas where we don't want it. And also if we've got biodiverse forests, they are more resilient to things like the spread of wildfires. So another thing that a lot of us take for granted is the beneficial ecosystem services that healthy ecosystems provide for us. And this is things such as clean air and clean water. So we could sit and talk about the benefits of nature restoration for the entire webinar, but I'll move on now to some of the myths that were spread last year on this. So one of the myths was that nature restoration is going to exclude economic activity. So this isn't true, because economic activities can still occur in restore areas, and it would really depend on the type of ecosystem as well as the measures taken. So things such as nature-friendly farming, carbon farming, wet farming, these are all economic activities which can occur, and many farms, there's huge uptake of these agri-eco schemes in Ireland. Aside from that, in the marine, there's sustainable fishing can happen with non-destructive fishing methods as well. So nature restoration definitely doesn't exclude economic activity. So the law will be difficult and costly to implement was another one of the myths. So again, it's going to depend on the ecosystem. It's going to depend on the level of degradation that the ecosystem was already in. And it's also going to depend on the measures that are needed to restore it. And there's actually some areas, especially in marine ecosystems, that will benefit greatly from passive restoration, which is basically where you just leave it alone. Nature has this amazing ability to regenerate itself. Not all ecosystems will be able to do that, especially ones in very bad condition, but there are some that if you just leave it alone, nature will be able to make a comeback. And at the moment, the EU already has losses of around 12 billion per year due to climate-related events. So restoring nature is going to help minimize this, and the benefits economically far outweigh any initial costs. So another myth was that it would undermine food security. So on the contrary, it's actually going to help secure long-term food security. Healthy ecosystems can provide, fundamental ecosystem services, like I mentioned before, like pollination, which is vital for food. And without having nature restoration, we actually risk food security. And another one of the big myths was that farmers are going to be forced to give up their land for restoration. So given some of the commentary that happened last year, there's absolutely no surprise that farmers were so worried about this and that they had such a fear about this. But this is completely untrue. In the actual text, it states that any restoration measures will be voluntary and that member states have to make it attractive to farmers as well. And it's already been shown in Ireland that it's going to be a priority to make funding available for restoration through our Nature and Climate Action Fund, which is at 3 billion and was announced earlier this year. So Guy's going to go into the myths a bit more deeply, but this is just a quick overview of some of them for us. So what happens next? So there's a final plenary vote in February of this year where all MEPs will have to vote again, and we hope that Irish MEPs are going to vote in favour of nature restoration like they did last time. And then after that, there will also be a final council vote where member states will get a chance to vote on it. And we hope that Ireland is going to continue being a champion of the nature restoration law. So I will stop sharing my screen now. And again, any questions, just pop them into the Q&A box. And I'll pass it over to Guy now and his presentation.
Hello, good evening. And first of all, thank you very much for organizing this, Grace, and thank you very much, everybody, for participating. My name is Guy Peer. I'm a conservation biologist, and I'm situated at IDIF. This is the center, the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research in Germany, Leipzig, as well as in UFZ. This is the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. So I'm working quite intensely with butterflies as one of the groups that I'm studying and monitoring butterflies. So I love nature, but if we care about nature, we have to do something about people. And for that reason, I've been working on policies and particularly on the European Common Agricultural Policy quite intensely in the last 10 or 15 years, in fact. And this has brought me to realize that a lot of the material that we are seeing around agriculture and nature restoration is indeed not exact. So I will share with you the screen for my presentation and start in a few seconds. And so the title of my presentation, I hope you see the screen. If not, Grace, you can stop me and let me know, is the fate of the nature restoration law and whether it affects us all. And so you can see already that I've been leading this letter that Grace was mentioning earlier with many scientists participating, and I will tell about this letter soon. But before I do that, I would like to give a short thank you to the many people with whom we've been working to acknowledge the fact that I'm not working alone. We are working in a group. I'm situated with a group focusing on agricultural and ecosystem services within the Department of Ecosystem Services, now called actually Biodiversity and People. And we have a set of projects that are trying to address the problems of agriculture and the conflict between agricultural production, the needs of farmers and food, and nature. So we all know that there are multiple crises happening at the moment, but they're interlinked with each other. And we need to understand that we are in a period of what you call a polycrisis. So we have climate change, which is constantly coming to the news. We have extreme events like drought, heat, flood events, cold shock, heat shocks, whatever. Together with that, we have the losses of biodiversity, and with that also the losses of ecosystem services that are related to biodiversity, such as pollination or pest controllers. Soil biodiversity is also affecting production, etc. We have the crisis of the lack of water and water quality, food crisis, health crisis affecting us all. But there are also socioeconomic crises that are actually related to that, such as crisis of inequity, changes of democracies or other governance, which are affected also by other factors that seem unrelated. But all these things are actually related very strongly to the fact that we are surpassing Earth's resources to support us, particularly land, but it's not the only thing. And this relates to the state of nature in many places. That brings, first of all, to the question, where's the money to protect nature? How do we address the problem? And that is actually why I've been working on the Common Agricultural Policy, which you can see in the assessment of the budgets of the EU in million euros over the so-called financial period of 7 years. So where are the investments into nature? And you can see the green part, which is the Common Agricultural Policy. It not only takes 40% of the European budget with 55 billion euros a year, but it is also the biggest place where, on the one hand, we could protect nature, but on the other hand, not necessarily managing so well. And this is a well-known fact. The Common Agricultural Policy is indeed one of the most central elements in European policy to address the crisis for nature, but it's failing to do that. The Farmland Bird Index shows constant declines in the status of birds. As you can see on the left side, in different parts of Europe, where red is the new member states, most rapid declines happening. And on the other side, you can see that we have also failed miserably in stopping or mitigating greenhouse gases. So the European level in yellow contains all the greenhouse gas emissions. You can see some decline, very small one compared to what we need. And in red, you could see the status for agricultural areas. And basically, we're not really mitigating. We're not reducing CO2 emissions, despite the instruments to supposedly stop that. On the other hand, even more staggering is the fact that the main aim of the CAP is actually to support farmers. And so farmers are currently demonstrating about the fact that there's no employment opportunities, declining in employment, etc. But if we are looking at the facts, what we see is that there's a structural change where there are more large farms and a lot less small farms. And only in the years 2005 to 2013, 3.5 million farmers went out of employment. So this is a structural change, and it's not because of the Common Agricultural Policy, but obviously we haven't been doing very well on exactly what farmers are saying, that they need support. So we're not supporting them. But that's not the problem of nature restoration. This is a problem with the current policies. And that brings us to the Green Deal. We have those directives which were enacted already 30 years ago or more, the Bird Directive, the Habitats Directive. We also have the Water Framework Directive. And before that, there was the Nitrate Directive. All of these were trying to improve the situation for European environment. And then we have the Common Agricultural Policy here with a paper from 2019 where we analyzed the budgets according to the different objectives. And you can see in green those objectives in the new CAP, actually, the current CAP, the new objectives for the environment, and they're taking a very small proportion of the budgets. So it is natural that the main aim of the Common Agricultural Policy is to support farmers and support income. We can agree or disagree about whether it's necessary or not, but it's not doing very well on any of the objectives, and partly because there's not enough investment into addressing that. And this is where the European Green Deal is trying to address these problems through a different set of instruments. The Nature Restoration Law is trying to address the poor state of nature, including agricultural areas, but not only. The Sustainable Use Regulation, which was also published by the Commission in June 22, was trying to regulate the fact that we have so many nutrients, so many agrochemicals coming into our water, affecting our health, affecting consumers, but also affecting biodiversity. And on top, there was supposed to be the Sustainable Food Systems Framework, which would address also the requirements from consumers' side, health issues, unhealthy diets, etc. There are also, of course, many other elements of the package called the European Green Deal, such as the climate law, etc. I put them aside. Today, I will only concentrate on the nature restoration law, but I will mention later on also the other components. So, Grace was already telling a little bit about the nature restoration law, and I will not go into too many details. But the main point about this new law is that it's really unique in its kind. For a long time, the European Union does not have any new instruments for protection of nature and for restoring nature. We have the obligation, which the EU has signed as well, for the global biodiversity framework, where we need to restore nature. And what the nature restoration law is trying to do is to set obligations for the member states for terrestrial areas, for marine ecosystems, urban areas, rivers, floodplains, but also for pollinators, for agricultural areas, and for forests. The reason I'm listing in these and the reason why I painted them in different colors is because this is a very interesting approach. On the one hand, terrestrial areas are just areas, marine, in a way, these are ecosystems. Urban areas are also not an ecosystem exactly. So there's a mix of approaches here in terms of covering areas, in terms of covering different types of ecosystems. But when you're thinking about pollinators, for instance, that's not a taxonomic group. It's not an area. Pollinators are rather a functional group of what animals are actually doing. And that includes, of course, insects, but also many other animals that are functioning as pollinators. So in this sense, the uniqueness also of the nature restoration law is the combination of different approaches to address nature restoration law, to address the needs of nature restoration. Together with many authors, Daniel Herring was leading this paper. We published an assessment of the nature restoration law in Science in December 2023, where we came to the conclusion that despite the negotiations, despite some watering down processes, overall the nature restoration law is extremely strong. It is very promising for addressing the needs, partly because of the approach that the Commission has taken in installing a law, meaning that member states can start implementing it almost immediately. They don't need to install own legislation in order to do that. And so there are many lessons that the Commission and the EU generally learned from the failures of previous policies and really are addressed within the nature restoration law. On the other hand, because it is so powerful, there was, of course, a lot of criticism because some actor groups do not want this law to advance forward. And so during especially the year 2023, we've heard a lot of claims, which Grace already mentioned, including that the law will risk food security, it will take away jobs, it will put a burden on society, it will prevent Europe from feeding the world, or even that it will force farmers to abandon 10% agricultural land. There were also claims against marine areas, etc. But today I want to focus only on those claims that are related to agriculture. As a scientist, when I hear these claims, it's obvious to me, and it's obvious to many of my colleagues, that this is basically misinformation, if not disinformation, because those distributing these claims know that they are wrong. For instance, about the 10% agricultural land. And so, as scientists, we found ourselves in a very problematic situation where we are asking ourselves, how should we react to such an attack on the nature restoration law that we know that is essential? And we approached different stakeholders, different decision makers, asked, what can we do to help? And we were told, well, the best thing is that you express your opinions best because you know the evidence, you know the science. And so this is what we did. In order to debunk the misinformation, we took one claim after the other. We took 6 in the beginning. Later on, we published a second version in July 2023 with 24 authors. We addressed one claim after the other, showing that they are basically wrong. We obtained signatures from 6,000 scientists, not only in the EU, but also others, mostly from environmental scientists, but also agronomists, economists, and others who were supporting the message and supporting what we were stating. So what I would like to do now is going through some of the examples here of why each of these claims are wrong in a more systematic way through the science of the claim and counterclaim. Let's start with food security. It sounds almost intuitive that if you take land out of production, you produce less. And if you are scaling this up through an international law, in this case of the nature restoration law, and you're reducing production everywhere in the EU, then of course it could affect production, and consequently you could imagine that it will affect the amount of food produced and therefore food security. Sounds really interesting, but it makes very little sense because, first of all, production reduction from the nature restoration law are probably completely marginal. The reason being, first of all, that the nature restoration law is not speaking about taking land out of production. It is actually talking about improving habitats. And this can be done in many ways, including extensification, including the reduction of chemical use or other means to improve habitat. We're not yet talking even about taking land out of production. Only in very rare cases, such as rewetting, we're talking about taking some land out of production. The other reason is that usually nature restoration is done in marginal land where the production is lower. And so the impacts that are likely to happen through the nature restoration law are pretty marginal. But beyond that, if we're really talking about food security, we need to ask ourselves, what are the risks to food security? And nature restoration or nature protection is not one of them. The biggest risks currently in the world are already occurring on the map that you are seeing for quite a few minutes, which are climate change, extreme events, the loss of pollinators, which is affecting 3/4 of the crops in the world, land degradation, soil degradation, which is extremely severe in many countries in the EU and not only in other parts of the world. And soil degradation also leads to production reductions. And if you want to stop that, what you could do, for instance, is restore landscape features that hold the soil or improve soil conditions by restoring the habitats in grasslands, for instance. So what it leads is that if we want to secure food production for the future, then nature restoration is one of the ways to prevent the losses from the other pressures that we are seeing within the polycrisis that we are seeing. So nature protection is actually one of the means to address the risks to food security rather than the risk itself. What about jobs? Again, it sounds very intuitive, and this is what we typically hear in political discussions, that one wants to demonstrate that somebody might go out of jobs if, for instance, they have to abandon the land for nature restoration. So again, it can happen, especially in the fisheries areas. There is still overfishing within marine areas, within protected marine areas. And so it is obvious that if protected areas are better installed and managed, then some fishermen or vessels will have to go out of these areas. This can affect their jobs, yes. It can also happen due to rewetting, that some people may be compensated or be offered a compensation to leave this land aside, and this will affect their jobs as well. But that's actually the case for any new policy or regulation. So some actors are always affected, but it's easy to take the losses and to ignore the gains. And first of all, the main question should be, what are the causes of losses of job in agriculture and fisheries? And the answer is that, well, the biggest cause of job losses is that people are being replaced by machines. We have structural changes emerging from the fact that you don't need as many people. And so the sector is not affected by nature restoration. It's rather affected by the expansion of strong farmers or strong farms or other actors such as retailers that are reducing the benefits. But this has nothing to do with the nature restoration law. It has to do with the failures of the CAP or other failures, but it's not about the nature restoration. The other thing is that if you're talking about the losses of jobs without talking about the potential gains of jobs, then you're producing a very biased picture. So yes, there are issues relating to rural exodus and the loss of employment and employment opportunities, especially for young people. But the solutions reside in looking for solutions. So I'm not saying automatically the nature restoration law will produce jobs. This will be false. But member states are forced to think about this and to try to find solutions. And that means that jointly, the Common Agricultural Policy, potentially the nature restoration law, but also the Sustainable Food Systems framework could offer solutions towards crop diversification, income diversification, localized markets, reducing the value chain, or creating green jobs. And in this sense, the nature restoration law has a huge potential for the creation of green jobs like ecotourism and others. And therefore, claiming that the nature restoration law will take jobs is simply false from almost every perspective. What about the claim that we've heard about the burden of on society? So we've heard that we just had COVID-19. Well, it's not really over. We have a war ongoing still in Ukraine, affecting Europe. This is affecting society, and we cannot now add new regulations that will affect society. But then, of course, the question is, what is society in this case? Of course, if there's a certain burden on some people, this is a burden. Yes, there might be some restrictions on cities, municipalities, or regional authorities on how they manage the common agricultural policy, etc. So there can be some burdens, but society is more than just a few farmers that will be affected. The problem is that society is currently paying twice, if not more than twice, for the current farming model. So if we're talking about the burden on society, and the biggest burden is unsustainable farmers, sorry. So first of all, we are subsidizing farmers with about 40% of the European Union's budget. This is a lot of money. And on the other hand, this support is going for any business model in general at the cost of supporting mostly unsustainable farming, affecting climate change, leading to biodiversity declines. Let's remember that agriculture is the key lead or key driver of biodiversity declines in terrestrial areas. Pesticide overuse, nitrogen pollutants, affecting also water quality, but also water scarcity. In some places, agriculture is number one source, taking actually the land or taking the water from many other interests. And we need to remember that the costs to society are not just the direct fact that we don't have access to clean water, but also health impacts through the agrochemicals or antibiotics or other things that go into our water, into our food, and affecting our water and food. So we are paying the costs of unsustainable farming in many ways. Now, in the impact assessment, among the many impact assessments that accompany the nature restoration law, the Commission assessed a value of 12 to 1 in terms of the benefits to costs, meaning that this is really an investment from a monetary perspective. But we need to go beyond just monetary questions. If we're really talking about society, we should ask about winners or losers. And so if we're talking about the fact that in the Netherlands, for instance, the vast majority of people have no access to clean water, not to speak of a risk if they jump into the water, then restoring nature, restoring the quality of soils, water, etc., is really an insurance for our health, for our well-being, for having access to a place where we can restore ourselves both physically and mentally. And this is something that goes far beyond just monetary value for society at large. So I was very surprised that when we published our open letter in June and later on in a broader version in July 23, there was a lot of attention in the media to the claims we were making, a lot of attention to the explanations and to the arguments we brought onto the table. And we heard that arguments that we published were indeed used by not only signatories, scientists speaking on behalf of science, but also policymakers, NGOs, etc. And it affected also the EPP campaign. We actually met some members of the EPP, and immediately afterwards, they've actually changed their approach to a certain extent. And we were very happy to see that at some point, even some EPP members admitted that the campaign was over-aggressive, changed their approach, and even changed their opinion, partly, we believe, with the help of these arguments, leading to the situation where if in June there was a vote of 44 against 44 at the environmental committee, which one couldn't believe that happens in an environmental committee of the parliament, then in July, the parliament actually passed with a small, but at least with some majority, and the law could at least move forward, because if it was rejected by the parliament, it would have ended at that point and sent back to the commission. It is still very disappointing at that point to see that only 51.7% of policymakers voted in favor of the nature restoration law, because eventually, if we are looking at the consensus, not only from a scientific perspective, but also from a societal perspective, then in an assessment from the Eurobarometer with many citizens, 96% of society really supports nature and sees value in protecting and restoring nature. So there is really a consensus here in society, and maybe this is part of the reason why eventually the law has passed. Now, as of July 2023, there were not only the positive vote for the nature restoration law, but also a long line of amendments that were proposed by the parliament and voted in favor, which would have watered down so significantly that the nature restoration law would have been a failure at the end. I'm not going into all the details because luckily the negotiations afterwards improved the situation, and some elements were improved. Some elements still remain a little bit weak, but at least, for instance, Article 9, which covers agriculture, was reinstalled. and there was an agreement which was really achieved positively for binding targets on most of the measures. So this is kind of positive news. On the other hand, we were quite disappointed to see that member states have now the opportunity to choose whether they link the common agricultural policy, this is the CAP here, or the common fisheries policies as sources of funding for the nature restoration law. If they do that, they lose an important opportunity, which we see in the fact that you don't need to do much beyond just improving the CAP for biodiversity in order to meet the nature restoration law. Another strange decision that was taken in the negotiations was to add a so-called emergency break, which allows member states to actually halt implementation of the nature restoration law under exceptional circumstances. And from a scientific perspective, it makes very little sense because even under exceptional circumstances, given that 70% of arable land is used for feed and fuel, then I cannot imagine a situation where releasing land from the nature restoration law implementation will have any effect on food production or the lack of food in Europe. So it's not very logical. So in this case, I would say that misinformation was retained all the way into the legislation. But we can live with that. At the moment, the good news is that the Environmental Committee voted already favorably for the agreement by the trilogue, so the agreement among the Parliament, Council, and the Commission. And this is probably a good sign that it is hopefully going to be approved by the Parliament in February. And even though some elements were compromised from a scientific perspective, I would say the law is still quite powerful, and I think we should all hope that it passes through the Parliament. Still, there will be implementation challenges, especially because monitoring is not sufficient, but potentially solutions could be found at the national level or other levels in the future. And this is a natural situation for policy implementation. So, slowly to wrap up, I showed you the picture earlier of the European Green Deal with the CAP in the middle because it is so central for implementation. And we have three elements which I mentioned earlier, the nature restoration law being a very important one, the sustainable use regulation, again with the same claims and very much based on misinformation, was rejected completely by the European Parliament, which is extremely disappointing given that this is really about the health of citizens. And despite 1 million citizens that signed a call for the EU to advance this law, the Sustainable Food Systems Framework was never published by the Commission. We know that it was ready for publication in autumn 23, but we never heard a word from von der Leyen or anybody else in the Commission. It was simply silenced and disappeared, meaning that it will not come within the current period of the Commission. And this is extremely disappointing, given that it could offer a lot of solutions which neither the CAP nor other elements could offer. So why is all this happening? What we see is that there's a lot of pressure on Brussels, on policymakers in Brussels to take decisions which don't necessarily favor citizens. We have 25,000 lobbyists sitting in Brussels, which is a very conservative estimate. That means 33 to 1 policymaker. And at least the gut feeling is that members of the parliament basically feel that they could act independently in Brussels compared to what they say to their own voters in their home countries. And misinformation is extremely central in confusing people, in creating what is called pluralistic ignorance, which means that most people tend to believe in things which are not necessarily correct, such as we need to produce more or Europe is feeding the world. But misinformation can also weaken science and evidence and polarize the debate, where we can see that there's an imaginary conflict between farmers and the rest of society, whereas if one speaks to farmers, many of them are nature-oriented. Many of them feel that they're actually doing good and want to do good. So here, coming back to science and evidence might help. So to wrap up and finish, if we look at the European Green Deal and the nature restoration law therein, this is really important for not only for nature, but also for the future of Europe. The European Green Deal has been sold as the most important package of the Commission, and for good reasons. We do have a polycrisis which will affect billions of people on Earth. But it is also under intense political debate with many implications for many of us, especially the younger generations. But even elder people will be affected immediately by what is currently happening. And so this toolkit is really important for many of us. Um, and the nature restoration law, in this sense, is the exception that proves the law, the rule, because, in my opinion, what happened here is that the fact that everybody cares for nature, the fact that everybody understands that we need to restore nature, has made it into a local success story, which could help strengthening the EU, but it still needs to pass. And otherwise, some things may crumble also in our trust of the EU. So, what can we do about that? First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge the importance of nature restoration law for the polycrisis that is affecting all of us. We are all sitting in this boat, and that agriculture is extremely central within the NRL. And I've already demonstrated that some of the arguments are based on misinformation or misconceptions. And so better understanding of why this is misinformation is already helpful. Now, what I want to highlight is that as a recommendation, I would not say listen to the science, because it doesn't make sense to just listen. It's not that scientists should speak up and everybody else should listen, but rather try to use the science, try to engage the scientists, because the producers, those who have produced this knowledge and can synthesize it, can also speak for themselves. They're not stakeholders. They're doing that in order to help society. And so as scientists, often we can come to the debate and offer our help rather than support one side or the other. It's also very important to acknowledge that the feeling of farmers that are not included is often correct. But one of the problems is with farmer representatives who are not necessarily doing a good job in representing their own people. And so there is actually conflict between what farmer organizations claim on behalf of farmers and what is the reality for farmers themselves. And last but not least, we should remember that complexity does not mean that we don't have solutions. And here, science is one of the areas where we are used to working with complexity. So, to finish here, maybe the only thing that I would like to add is that we really need to act fast. And then nature restoration law may give us a way of finding how to act fast together with goodwill. With that, I thank you for your attention and would like to give some time for discussion.
Thanks, Guy. That was brilliant. So we've got a few questions here that we can have a look at. So the first one, do you have any concerns in relation to the vote in plenary and at council level? So I can answer that one as well. As like Guy was saying, the biggest group that was opposing the nature restoration law, the European People's Party, even they have announced now, that they're quite happy with the text. During the trilogue negotiations, there was a lot of compromises, a lot of issues were talked and discussed about, and things were changed. So personally, I'm hoping that the vote will get through the plenary and at council level as well, because the Irish government has, publicly stated their support for the nature restoration law. And if Guy, you want to add anything?
I would say that I'm optimistic. I would like to see that it happens. Concerns always exist, and sometimes there are surprises to the strength of attacks from specific actor groups, as it was the case with the sustainable use regulation. I think many of us believed until the last moment that it's going to pass. It was a surprise that for the sustainable use regulation, despite already watering down and compromises found, etc., it was still rejected. And even the most pessimistic among us did not believe that it happens. For the nature restoration law, especially after hearing members of Renew Europe and EPP saying explicitly that they will support the law and that they can support it, and especially after hearing some saying, we managed to water it down, then they feel happy that they watered it down. If that makes them happy and they can come back to their voters and say that they successfully watered down important elements of that, let's be optimistic and see that it happens. But I think it's good to always remind them that there's an expectation to act responsibly.
Yeah, so another question that we have, can you please expand a little more on the sustainable food systems framework in context to the unbalanced power system that currently exists with processors and retailers leaving an unfair return to farmers?
Yes, I'm very happy to talk about the sustainable food systems framework because it is actually the biggest gap in European policy at the moment. So whenever you speak to policymakers about the CAP, they would tell you, well, the CAP is not about consumers, it's about producers. It's not a social support system, but rather something that helps us in food production, etc. This is in fact a misconception because there are some instruments in the CAP that could support the reduction of value chains, and it's actually one of the objectives of the CAP, but it's marginal. It's not the main aim. And so we have a problem where the needs of citizens, consumers, the needs of healthy diets, accessibility to fruits and vegetables, hopefully such that are not full of pesticides and other chemicals, they are extremely important for health and well-being of many people. But that requires a systematic thinking exactly on how do we decentralize a system which has become extremely centralized at the hand of very few actors, retailers, few landowners, supermarkets, for instance. There's the so-called Tesco effect, where the niche is being taken over by just few retailers that offer everything, which means that even if you're vegan and super environmental friendly, you would still go to the same supermarket because it contains also your niche. That means that more and more people go and pay money to the same retailers. And of course, in the background, there's very untransparent situation where you actually don't know when you buy a certain product who's standing behind this product. So how many of us unknowingly support Nestle or Coca-Cola or other companies that constantly buy local producers or local food producers, etc.? On the other hand, for farmers, a major problem is that they're often being forced to sell their products to a very specific retailer or whatever else. And this is very, very strongly affecting, for instance, the milk producers. So in many places in Europe, you cannot produce ecological milk, or what you call bio in Germany, because it will simply be mixed with many others. And there are only few producers that can later on bring it to the market. So there have been multiple requests from farmers as well to enhance direct food systems where they can market their own products, for instance, in local markets or through having a place of their own where they can do that. But that requires a system of support, which doesn't exist actually in the EU. So the sustainable food systems was supposed to complement existing policies towards addressing the needs of both farmers and consumers in order to find a holistic solution for consumers and producers together and considering the retailers in the middle. The reason that it's so important is not only within Europe, but also when you're looking at external effects of the EU or what you call the leakages. So one of the claims which constantly come up, especially in the meat and food production, is that, well, with the current consumption level of meat and milk products, if we now reduce it for nature restoration because we want to extensify land use in Europe, then we still have to produce somewhere else. And that means deforestation, for instance, in Brazil or other places, in order to produce the same amount. But then the solution is to reduce consumption. The solution is to explain to people why consuming so much meat and milk is unhealthy for them, for the environment, why it is leading to deforestation, etc. And part of this education comes also in monetary systems, in labeling, etc. So the point is that you cannot solve one problem without leakage to another. And for that reason, we need a package of solutions to address the problems at both the consumers and producers sides. That was a long answer to a short question, but I think it clarifies why many scientists, especially people working on sustainability questions, have been awaiting this law very eagerly and quite disappointed to see that it simply evaporated all of a sudden in the moment Timmermans stepped out of office, basically.
Yeah, it was a very important law. I think it's a very complex issue, so I think you answered that really well. Another question we have, are the types and income levels related to new jobs measured? So the new jobs which will be created through nature restoration, like we were mentioning earlier about you know, certain job losses in certain sectors. Has there been any measurement on the types of new jobs that will occur and the income levels of these?
So there are two questions here. One is the question of which jobs, and the second about income levels. And both of them are would-be questions, in the sense that it's very hard to evaluate in advance what will be the impact of a policy to come, especially because once the law comes into action, how member states are going to implement it is quite open. We don't know yet. What we do know, and this is actually an improvement that came through the negotiation stage, was that member states are now requested. I would have been happy if they were demanded to, but they're only requested or recommended to explore funding opportunities and jobs opportunities for the nature restoration law. And so member states will need to install some processes to explore, for instance, business opportunities, to explore funding opportunities, etc. They're not obliged to do that, but we do anticipate that they will do so because it brings benefits. And businesses will be doing that whether member states do that legally or not. Um, Income levels are going to depend, for instance, on retailers, on other actors that have the interest of making sure that it will not happen. So there are always, beneficiaries and losers, and it's very hard to anticipate. It's also not my main area of expertise, but in that case, anyway, I think it's mostly a question of would be of questionnaires of complicated processes, and to this end, there are several EU projects that are trying to explore that, and some calls for projects that have the job of assessing that in years to come. Um, so, yeah, it's quite an open question, but it's a complex system where I think the shared benefits of all of us is that farmers that deliver for the environment and for society will benefit more. And there could be systems that will do that. But it's not the job of the nature restoration law per se, because it's not a funding mechanism. So this we need to understand. The NRL is not a funding mechanism per se. That means that what member states will do with CAP, or how they will promote benefits for people that are engaged in that, is pretty much an open question, but an interesting one to follow, and where scientists will definitely try to help in finding solutions, I would say.
Yeah, and that's it sort of ties in nicely with the next question there. Are you confident that sufficient funding will be put in place? So again, like you were saying, the nature restoration law isn't a funding mechanism, and that each member state will have 2 years to submit their national restoration plans. And these will include the funding opportunities within that.
No, I'm not confident that there will be enough funding to do that. I would like to be optimistic that it will happen, but reaching confidence means that I would want to see that there are really national plans on how to do that. And the European Commission will likely evaluate whether they do that. But between that and confidence, there is a large distance. Part of this distance has to do with harmful subsidies. So one of the biggest problems that we have nowadays is that you could invest X in doing good, but then when you invest 10 times more in not doing good, sorry about that, there's a small disturbance. So if you're investing a lot more in not doing good, or in unsustainable farming, or even in pressures on the environment, then eventually you may cancel your own investments. And this is a big problem in agriculture, in fisheries, in climate investments, etc. And so the question of sufficient funding is a question of how much investment do we make into this working, and then how much cancellation of components that are currently impeding the targets. And this is a very big open question that I believe that the nature restoration law can really be helpful in addressing parts of it, but whether it will be sufficient and whether I'm confident is, time will tell. I'm a lot more optimistic once the nature restoration law is approved, and once member states demonstrate that they are also ambitious in making it happen and find the mechanisms to fund. The main reason why we could be quite optimistic is that I think businesses do see the opportunity. So one of the interesting responses to the what you called misinformation campaign was a letter published by many businesses, which actually have nothing to do with the environment, that basically said also for renewable energy. So there was very strong response against the claims made was the claims that were made by policymakers, especially when it comes to markets. And this is because businesses do see the opportunity in there. And so we could be optimistic that at least there will be a lot of pressure to invest sufficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question, in Ireland, non-dairy farmers are mostly low income. Do you think actions will be sufficiently funded, and will it be possible to avoid double funding from other schemes?
This is a very interesting question. So first of all, the question should be, are farmers really having a lower income than others? And the surprising answer is that it's not as intuitive as people think. The reason it's not intuitive is because the costs of living are very different in rural areas than in urban areas. And so if you look at the fact that farmer income is actually lower, you should also consider the fact that they don't always pay rent and their cost of living is lower. So one thing we need to check always when we are talking about incomes is whether the income is really lower. Having said that, there are definitely farmers that don't get enough support. And we should all have the interest that farmers get more support than they currently do, especially if they invest in environmentally friendly measures. And extensification, for instance, in dairy areas does cost a lot. If you have 10 cows instead of 100, you have 10 times less money. And so this needs to be compensated somehow, and the nature restoration law should at least help in finding the funding mechanism, especially if member states decide, strangely enough, not to put the funding through the CAP, which already exists. It just needs to be approved. But the last and interesting part of this question is the question about double funding. Why should we actually avoid double funding? So, in fact, if a farmer does more to deliver public goods, then this farmer should benefit more. That means that we should employ, for instance, pointing system or other methods to make sure that the benefits are proportional to the delivery. And in that case, the question of double funding is a problem of transparency of the system or others. But actually, I personally, at least from a scientific perspective, would not say that automatically double funding is a problem. It's a problem of monitoring and regulatory issues, but it's not a problem per se. If there will be, for instance, double funding, which exists already, where you could ask for direct payments plus agro-environment measures on top. And so if we find the ways where payments complement each other to achieve more, then I don't think that double funding per se is a bad solution. I think the aim should be public money for public goods, and the means should be more points towards those who deliver, and especially support towards aims that we all support from a social, economic, and environmental interests, which is basically sustainability.
So another question, this time about urban areas. So could you tell us more about what is included for urban areas in the nature restoration law?
Urban areas is actually an entire topic, and one that I'm not sure that we can cover today in this presentation. And partly because the text of the nature restoration law is not as clear as in other parts. And there have been even criticism that the nature restoration law could have been a lot more powerful. So what I would like to say in that case is that the interesting part of the urban area is that it forces municipalities to work more and to make more effort towards the delivery of green spaces for citizens. And the interest of doing that is because the life quality of citizens will affect also their health. We're talking about climate change. So cities are also heat. They're suffering from overheat compared to their environment, especially in places that lack green. There's lack of access to greenery. So this is affecting mental health, physical health, temperatures, etc. About that again. So the nature restoration law will demand municipalities to invest more into urban green spaces. And this is really important. We have a new project where we've set his partner as well, which is called UGP Plus, or Urban Green Planning, greening plans. And we will explore exactly these questions of how cities can do better for the environment. And the fact that the nature restoration law demands that from municipalities is really important in that case.
Perfect. So another question and a comment. So congratulations to Guy for the excellent talk. My question is, why is the reintroduction of regionally extinct animals, for example, in Ireland, the wolf, not part of the nature restoration law? Was it left out deliberately to appease the farming lobby, or what's the reasoning behind this?
So the short answer is that I cannot answer this question because I have not been part of the negotiations of what is in or out or the decisions taken by the Commission. Um, in general, the nature restoration law is not about rewilding or rewilding basically. So the restoration of ecosystem functions. And maybe we should even be happy at the moment that it did not include the protection of species, which is already part of the habitat directives and the bird directives. So, for instance, the world population are already included in the habitats directive, and I don't think there's a new legislation necessary in order to address that. Um, so, personally, in the example, for instance, of species such as the wolf, I do not think that the place to do that is the nature restoration law per se. It is not an opinion whether it should or should not be done, but the annexes, so basically the species list or the habitat list of what needs to be restored or improved, is already done in the habitats directives or in the bird directives. Um, Regarding the wolves specifically, I think it's worthy to note what is actually happening in Europe, where the wolves are being used actually as a scapegoat for basically hate. So what we're seeing is that instead of saying China or Jews or Muslims or whatever we are hating, it's kind of being used for channeling hate for something which is traditionally very strong in people's emotions, but has nothing to do with actual reality. So, in my opinion, the entire discussion around the wolf is really based on not just misinformation, but invented claims. So, very strange stuff. The Commission just announced, in fact, that they want to reduce the risk for humans from zero attacks in 40 years. And I'm wondering, how can you reduce the level below zero? Because that would mean that will somehow help people reproduce. I don't know. Maybe they become storks or something like that. So personally, I think this is part of a populistic attack in order to gain votes prior to the election from extremists. But this is a completely different topic and one that, in my opinion, does not relate to the nature restoration law, but rather to other channels of people's needs of polarization for other purposes. This is very sad. Um, but if we come back to the nature restoration law, what I think is the positive issue is that the nature restoration law actually tries to reduce these kind of polarized debates. So it includes new indicators that are consensus also in society with farmers, etc. So if we look back into the agricultural areas, then we don't have wolves, but we have butterflies as an indicator. And I find this great because most people like butterflies, are not against them. And even if you talk to the most anti-environmental farmers, they don't hate butterflies. They will be happy to hear how they could do better for butterflies, which typically would mean leaving some habitats, reducing chemical use, etc. And so finding the channels through positive emotions, through the link to nature, is a lot more effective than starting to fight over one species or another, where we know that there's a lot of negative emotions involved. And I think this is another achievement made in the nature restoration law on focusing on the positive aspects, such as pollinators.
Now we're getting quite a lot of questions through here. I know, Guy, you're happy to stay on a little bit longer to answer some. Let me just find them here. So is there anything in this law that will discourage or prevent any more clearage and drainage of wild land to non-biodiverse farmland?
No, I'm not aware of elements of the nature restoration law which will encourage the conversion of land. But I was disappointed that, in fact, one of the weaknesses of the nature restoration law is the setting of other priorities at higher place, also in places where it doesn't make much sense or it's not helpful. One example, for instance, is that if there's a plan for renewable energy infrastructure, then it will get higher priority over nature restoration law, although some of the renewable energy discussions or production is actually completely unsustainable, such as biofuel production or forestry plantations, basically for producing biomass to burn, or ridiculous carbon capture systems which will benefit zilch to climate but take a lot of public attention. And these infrastructures are, to a large extent, a huge waste of money and diverting from the need of reduction of CO2 emissions. So the setting of lower priority for the nature restoration law can allow member states, at least in some situations, not to take an action or even to prioritize other actions, also for military issues or others. And so this is a weakness of the nature restoration law. And maybe another place where the nature restoration law can shoot its own foot is in the case of planting trees. So at the last stage of the negotiations, a new element came in, which was the amendment to plant billions of trees in Europe. And in some habitats, you may need that, but in other habitats, such as grasslands, you don't need trees. In some forests, trees can grow by themselves, so they can regenerate and you don't need to plant them. And the risk, of course, is that this will be hijacked for the purpose of plantations or other elements which actually are counterproductive. So we are seeing in Scandinavia, for instance, that the state of forest birds is actually declining. And this is because old growth forests are being replaced by plantations. And so the risk in the nature restoration law is that it can promote the replacement of natural habitats actually with plantations. But we're hoping that through good monitoring and good natural strategic plans, it can be prevented. So I would not say that the nature restoration law can discourage or contradict it, but there are, of course, weaknesses that one needs to be aware of.
And that goes nicely into this question of how much of a role will civil society organisations such as NGOs play in the design of the national restoration plans?
I think they will be extremely central for doing that. It's not only about farmers or fisheries, it's about people and it's about people's health. The more engagement there will be in helping with implementation, in finding solutions, in finding win-wins where there's really job creation, in additional investments, especially from the private sector, from businesses that can promote that, the more empowerment of citizens to also monitor, for instance, in citizen science, to actually go out and collect data on what is the situation in forests or in grasslands, or what is the status of butterflies. The more engagement in society there is in building up these plans, the more member states can feel that they do a good job and consequently also potentially put a more ambitious plan. And this, of course, will depend a lot on the level of conflicts. So the more conflict mitigation and mediation can be done, the more solutions there are for trade-offs among different interests in society, which are natural, the more goodwill will emerge. And with that, more ambition can come. So I would think that the more each of us can support it, the better it is for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. I know we'll be hoping for early and ongoing stakeholder engagement throughout the draft and the implementation of the restoration plans. So regarding farmer representation, what is the situation in Germany? Because here in Ireland, agroecological farming organisations are not at the farm stakeholder tables because we don't have the numbers. This means that agroecological solutions are not being advocated from farmers on the ground, and farmers are currently represented by the industrial farming community. Can we see the environmental lobby and scientists adding a call to include the agroecological perspective to the farm representative forums? So that's an interesting question.
This is a truly interesting question and one that is very difficult to answer because, in fact, the ones that should be speaking their own voice are the farmers. So I, as a scientist, can engage, and we are engaging in Germany, for instance, in interdisciplinary projects where we talk to farmers, we try to understand their needs, We had, for instance, 6 so-called platform meetings in 2 federal states, in Thuringia and Baden-Württemberg. And it was really interesting to hear the voice of farmers and what are the problems and what are the solutions, and try to deliver for them. So the reality is indeed that farmers are poorly represented when it comes to the policy. And the question already formulates the problem quite well. In a study that Sebastian Lackner, a colleague of mine who's an agricultural economist, did, they conducted a survey among farmers to understand what are actually the opinions of farmers about nature. And the outcome was basically that farmers roughly divide into 3/3, meaning a third are really environmental oriented and natural oriented. Another third are, I would say, opportunistic, or they would respond to market instruments. That means that 2/3 of the farmers could work with the Commission or with us and with society to find solutions, or will at least respond to improvements in the policies. And only a third, the last third, are the more conservative farmers that might say, just leave me alone, I want to do my stuff and I don't care. Even these may respond, for instance, to sanctions or to regulations, etc. So there are different ways to work with different audiences. The problem is that the narrow interests of the conservative third are represented through the big agricultural lobbies, the agrochemical industry, and others, which are actually the ones representing farmers when it comes to the discussions, especially in Brussels. I've watched the discussions in Ireland, and I noticed that in Ireland, the most vocal organization is the Irish Farming Association, which, to my understanding, is not actually a farming organization at all. It is, if one is looking at the funding mechanisms, then it actually comes to agrochemical industry rather than, or big ag, as you call it, or big agri. So it's not actually representing farmers. But then the question is, who will do a better job in representing, and whether policymakers will invite them to the table? And that's the problem. So if a policymaker in Brussels or in Ireland or in Germany doesn't bother inviting those smaller farmer organizations or the family farmers, then it's also their lack of responsibility, or they are actually supporting the problem. To the question, what is happening in Germany, to a certain extent, it's a bit more complicated, because the biggest farming organization is actually really a farming organization. And I've spoken to people within this organization. This is a the Bauernverband, basically. That's very traditional organization. If you see the meetings, it's typically, white elder men, a minority of women, a lot less younger farmers. But if you speak to the actual people there, normally they would say, well, the opinions are quite diverging and not very homogeneous within us. But still, when it comes to talking to policymakers, they would want to show a single union, and the consequence is that they will represent the opinion of the minority. And this is leading to a lock-in. So smaller farmer organizations that are trying to represent the more environmental directions, etc., are weaker politically, also because they're trying to represent a very heterogeneous group of people with many interests. Some of them care for animals, some care of other environmental issues. So the problem in many places, not only Germany, is the fact that those interests are spread among many organizations. And so studies already in the 80s show that it's a lot easier to represent the narrow interest of a small but very homogeneous organization rather than broader but a lot more heterogeneous group of people. And that's a problem that only farmers find own solutions to establish, for instance, a new organization, or to strengthen themselves and demand that they come to the table, can they find a solution. That's at least the observation and what we see in different countries, not only Germany or Ireland. I hope that helped answering this question.
Yes, thanks, Guy. So we've got the last question now. I think this is a nice question to end on as well. So how can we, interested individuals or local groups, support the NRL at the moment, and how can we support it after the upcoming vote as well?
This is a very interesting question, because it relates, at least in Europe, also to our perception of democracy, I guess. many of us would go and vote when there is the opportunity. And our voting can happen not only once in X number of years, but also in our daily actions, or by writing personally to policymakers like the members of the parliament and asking them to do that, or signing any petitions. But it depends on our own capacities and knowledge we have. And as long as we can keep in our comfort zone in terms of the knowledge we have and communicate it, then we do a good job on talking to our neighbors, talking to the family. And so for single individuals, it's always good to work in a collective and find the community-based way of working so that we don't feel alone. This is where I find a lot of potential in citizen science, and joining, for instance, on the efforts for monitoring biodiversity, because with a better picture of what is happening, we can also deliver more. So I know that in Ireland already since I think 2008 or 9, there's a butterfly monitoring scheme, for instance. If people join on that, especially in farmland areas, and collect data on what is actually happening there, and even help farmers collect their own data to demonstrate, for instance, that if you invest in putting a fallow land or a flower strip, you actually can see butterflies or birds or other species, then farmers or other individuals can help showing what is the value of restoring nature. And value is not only monetary value, but also the value of seeing swallowtail or seeing other beautiful butterflies on these landscapes. And so finding flowers and butterflies and helping in doing citizen science or speaking to our neighbors, speaking to policymakers, are many ways in which we can help being part of a socio-ecological frontier of change. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you, Guy. Okay, so we will wrap it up there. So like I said at the start, this webinar was recorded. So if you want to rewatch it, or if you know anyone that you think would be interested in it, it's going to be up on the Irish Wildlife Trust YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So make sure to check it out there. And a big thank you to everyone who turned up and all the really good questions. And thank you to Guy for your presentation and for answering all the questions as well. Okay,
Thank you very
so
much.
thank you. Thanks for your time. Okay, so good night, everyone, and we will see you back again next month for another webinar.